Okay, I think most people are here now, and there might be some other people joining as we go through today's event. Thank you to all of you for joining myself and my students here today. So this session is called Students Sharing Surprising Stories about Women, Peace and Security and Women's Peace Movements in particular. Today's event is going to have a focus on reframing peace-building narratives by adopting a feminist lens. So first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Shirley Graham, and I am the Director of the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. And I'm also the founder of the Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. And each of the students here today are all members of the Student Consortium, and they're all students at George Washington University. So what is the Student Consortium and why was it created in the first place? Well, we have to go back in time about 20 years to my own student experience to explain a bit more about the consortium. So when I was researching my master's degree in Dublin, Ireland, I was one of only 3 students who were out feminists. And so at that time, we were living in supposedly a post-feminist world, and we didn't need feminist activism anymore. And needless to say, this meant that my own research journey was at times a little bit isolating, and it could also be lonely. And I really craved having like-minded people around me who could be part of that journey. At the same time, the UN had recently adopted a Security Council resolution 1325. And that resolution was a breakthrough in terms of women's rights and feminist activism, because it was the first time the Security Council invited civil society and women's rights group into its chambers. And it heard about the disproportionate impact that conflict had on women. And as a result, it adopted this resolution that called on member states to ensure that women were included in all aspects of peace and security. We have known that women have always been there, but usually at the grassroots level in the informal peace-building processes. So anyway, if we fast forward 20 years and then we come up to more recent times, in 2020, during the global pandemic, I had a student approach me. Her name is Noelle Cohen. And Noelle was a master's degree student at that time at the Elliott School. And she was deeply concerned that the global pandemic, the COVID-19 global pandemic, was going to have a really adverse effect on her and the other students because of the isolating impacts of the pandemic. And she is passionate about women, peace and security issues and really wanted to connect with other students, civil society members and policymakers to be able to discuss this important topic. And at the same time, I was an executive committee member with the US Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. And we were having discussions about bringing in fresh perspectives and new voices and wanting to hear from younger activists and scholars. And so it made perfect sense that I would invite my students into this civil society working group. And so we created the Student Consortium, which now has over 200 members across DC universities and beyond, and that we would bring these 2 groups together. And one of the really important outputs or effects of this movement was that we now have a permanent seat on the executive committee of the Civil Society Working Group that is allocated specifically for students. And currently, our student leader, our president of the Student Consortium, Caroline Gilmore, is sitting in that particular seat. So that's a little bit about the background to the consortium and why it was created. But I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other students who've been involved in its development. So from the outset, we had student leaders come forward who wanted to really amplify the consortium. And I want to thank particular people. So Nick Zorowski, who was the first president of the Student Consortium, Noelle Cohen, who I've already mentioned, Romani Wilson, and Nina Platarotti, all previous presidents who are now GW alums. And they are all now working on gender issues in different organizations, in Alliance for Peacebuilding, in Women in International Security, and in USAID. So really important that we acknowledge them and the important work that they have done to get us this far. Before I go into introducing the students who are going to be talking today, I'm just going to talk for a moment about why it is so important to have a feminist lens in peacebuilding matters. Because, as I've already mentioned, women have been overwhelmingly excluded from formal peace and security processes and institutions. And yet women have mobilized at the grassroots level, and they've reached across religious, ethnic, and caste divides to build these peace movements. I'm thinking here particularly of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and also movements like the Liberian Mass Action for Peace. But we know that peace agreements are overwhelmingly excluding women. And yet when women are present, it makes the peace agreement more durable and more likely to last for 15 years or more. Now, this is really important because the average peace agreement only lasts for about 5 years. But despite that, as I've already mentioned, very, very low numbers of women are present. And yet, when we bring in a feminist lens or a feminist understanding of what's happening in war and peace, this creates a holistic picture of the context and the conflict. It helps us to understand how to prevent conflict, how to resolve conflict, and how to bring in diverse perspectives in the resolution of conflict as well. So as we all know, gender is about power and power relations. And so that feminist lens is really important because it helps us to understand how power is being dispersed by state institutions, by militia groups, and by multilateral institutions as well. So today we're going to have a look at 4 different stories from 4 different regions of the world. Each story centers on women's efforts to resist authoritarian regimes, to build democratic institutions and processes, and to overturn misogynistic systems. These systems and regimes attempt to silence, oppress, and marginalize women's voices, women's bodies, and women's experiences and perspectives. And so all of the women that we're talking about today are incredibly courageous with the risks that they take to strive for their inclusion in democratic processes and overturning these really harmful regimes. So I'm going to talk now about each of the students who are going to be sharing these stories with us. So, and also just before I introduce our first speaker, also want to mention that each of our speakers wants to engage you in the conversation. So they each have a particular question that they would like to ask you, and we're going to put that in the chat. And I think you might find some of the questions, or some of the answers to the questions, I should say, surprising. So we really would like to encourage you to engage in this conversation. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Barrett Liebermann. So Barrett is going to be our first speaker today. Barrett graduated from the George Washington University this year and majored in international affairs with a concentration in gender and minored in psychological and brain sciences. She was the co-director of government relations for No Lost Generations, a refugee advocacy organization at GW. Currently, she is interning at the Kurdish Peace Institute and has just begun her master's degree focused on global communications. So Barrett, I'm going to hand it over to you. Best of luck.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. And I just want to say I'm so honored to be a speaker here at PeaceCon, and thank you all so much for coming. Can you imagine living in a part of the world where women are assassinated just for speaking up about what needs to change? This is what's happening in North and East Syria, NES, and today I'm going to share stories from incredible women peace builders in the region who risk their lives every day to help other women create a world where they can feel safe. So polling question is going to come up. It's an open-ended question. There are no right or wrong answers. Just want to gauge a sense of media coverage. In the last year, how many articles or posts do you remember seeing that focused on Kurdish and non-Kurdish women in North and East Syria? So just take a little time to think about it and then answer in the chat. So I connected with some of these incredible women through my internship with the Kurdish Peace Institute, KPI. Even as an international affairs student, I knew very little about Kurdistan and Kurdish women before starting this internship. I had always been interested in the intersection between gender and international affairs, and this interest only expanded when I joined the Student Consortium for Women, Peace, and Security. I was so excited when I started my internship because I wanted to use my knowledge of gender and women, peace, and security to analyze Kurdistan. What started as an academic interest became so much richer when I actually got to talk with Kurdish and non-Kurdish women in North and East Syria and learn from their stories. So before I talk about my conversations with these inspiring women peace builders, I want to give a background about peace building in NES. Peace building in NES has always been integral, especially when ISIS took over newly independent areas just 6 months after the Rojava Revolution. The Rojava Revolution started in 2012 when 3 Kurdish majority areas in Syria declared their autonomy from the central government. Women's institutions in these areas were crucial to creating peace and establishing new democratic systems, and were under increased attack when ISIS came. They were also deeply important for sustaining peace after ISIS was ousted from the region, and for preventing ISIS cells from regaining power and influence. I connected with Amina Omar from the Syrian Democratic Council, Sia Rodi from Malajin, women from the Zenobia Women's Assembly, and women from the Women's Internal Security Forces in Raqqa, Syria, to ask them how they approach peace building during and post-conflict. Their responses highlight the incredible work that has already been done to create opportunities for women to be in decision-making roles, to emphasize women's empowerment at every level of society, and to create a community of trust where women are able to share their traumatic experiences and rebuild their lives. I want to talk about Amina Omar. Amina Omar is a Syrian Kurdish politician, and she served as the co-chair of the Syrian Democratic Council. She shared her experience as a peace builder who went to areas in NES that had just been liberated from ISIS. She described this work as extremely challenging because many people, especially women, were traumatized and divided by ISIS ideology and rhetoric. Imagine trying to rebuild a community that was ruled by a group that maintained power by brutalizing women and stripping them of their rights, to the point where they could not even leave the house without a male chaperone. That type of rhetoric doesn't just disappear overnight. Now, within that context, imagine trying to create a sustainable peace that actually includes women in these communities. Amina and her colleagues worked with local communities in these areas to promote peace and help people recover from and reconcile with their trauma. For women who had not been allowed to leave their house under ISIS control, women peace builders worked with them to create a community of trust, allowing them to share their experiences of sexual violence in a way where they were truly listened to and empowered. When referring to the women she worked with, Amina said, "They are very active. They speak up." There has been a major change in these regions in terms of women's advancement. Today, we can see how women are changing their society and advancing their leading role in building a democratic society. We had an impact on these women, and they had an impact on us. That quote really resonated with me. It is so important and inspiring to see these kind of initiatives in action. The initiatives that are led by women who understand how other women are impacted differently in conflict, who understand how to listen to women and how to ensure that they are really heard. The initiatives make sure that women in these communities are able to come into leadership positions, build confidence, and help sustain peace in their own communities. Sia Rodi is another incredible woman who I had the privilege of talking with. Sia is a member of Malajin, a woman's house in NES, and a woman's house is a social center that attempts to resolve disputes via community-based justice and protect women from violence. Sia also works to promote women's essential roles in peace-building initiatives. Sia recalled that women from different backgrounds, religions, and ethnicities were ready to start working to support the feminist communities and institutions in the early Syrian crisis and right after the ISIS invasion, specifically the institutions that supported women empowerment and guidance. Sia's responses show how important it was to have women from diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds included in these early peace-building initiatives, especially because ISIS gained so much power by demonizing people in religious and ethnic minorities. How can we have real sustainable peace if women with different perspectives are not given the chance to share their experiences and are not given the chance to create a community of inclusivity and cohesion? The work that Sia and the other women peace builders in NES do is a testament to the power of inclusivity. Women from the Zenobia Women's Assembly in Raqqa are also incredible peace builders in the region. They did ask that their names remain confidential, which highlights how unstable the security situation in NES still is. They work to promote peace in NES by establishing communes, councils, and committees under the administration to help advance women's rights in different communities. An amazing example of these committees in action is when women from Zenobia ask women in these communities what they need and then create economic projects based on those needs. This helps women have access to jobs when they weren't even allowed to work before. Through their reconciliation committee, they also help women who have been subjected to violence and persecution receive justice and proper care. They try to resolve violent cases between women and their families or husbands without going to court, and if this case cannot be resolved, they will send it to the court system. The Zenobia Women's Assembly constantly evaluates and meets the needs of women in NES by having monthly and bi-weekly meetings to report on activities in every town and region and dedicating individual committees to specific needs. However, there are limits to these committees because the Assembly has limited resources and still cannot reach all women needing support in every town or area. The women working at Zenobia see a future where every woman within and outside of Syria is liberated and empowered. When talking about their work, they said, "Sometimes we break social norms. We have faced many challenges, but we're still working. We believe every woman has a revolution inside of her." All of these incredible women are working to give other women the resources and tools they need to create their own power and their own peace. The women working in the internal security forces in Raqqa have made incredible advances in creating a women's security force that focuses on women and how to promote their safety and agency. They emphasized how important it was to have women working in these forces post-ISIS because women are usually uncomfortable approaching a man if they see suspicious activity, which can be anything related to ISIS propaganda. And they are also more likely to approach the women's forces or women's civilian organizations. Women are also often the first people to notice signs of ISIS reemerging, so it is so important that they are comfortable talking to women's security forces. They emphasize this community of trust, saying women's participation in trust helps us keep Raqqa safe. By creating a culture where women are able to express their concerns about ISIS cells reemerging and get justice when they are subjected to violence, the women's internal security forces and other women's organizations are able to put ISIS cells behind bars and create longer-lasting safety and peace. The women's internal security forces also help women develop essential skills in peace building by providing educational training on how to analyze the political and security situations in Syria and the Middle East, and how to work with other organizations to solve societal problems. They are creating new peace builders and also promoting women's agency through these educational trainings. The women in NES working in these organizations know how to create sustainable peace by understanding how conflict impacts women differently. The historic UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security recognizes how sexual violence is used as a tool during conflict and how sexual violence is perpetuated by underlying discrimination against women and girls. The women in NES are addressing sexual violence and gender oppression inflicted by ISIS by acknowledging discrimination against women in Syria and the Middle East, and establishing institutions that promotes women's crucial roles and equal participation in peace-building initiatives. They are also building a culture of trust, where women who have been subjected to sexual violence can confide in surrounding communities of women in order to get the support they need. Moving forward, women in NES deserve international recognition for the work that they have already done in peace-building initiatives. There are also many challenges in maintaining peace in the region because of ongoing conflicts and threats against democratic institutions in NES. As I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, several politically active women have been assassinated because they posed a threat to the patriarchal system upheld by ISIS and the Syrian government. This dangerous pushback against women's rights and advocacy underscores how important women's participation in peace-building initiatives is to create a safe and equitable future. The international community can help women advance women in peace-building initiatives in this region by collaborating with these organizations and providing resources to allow these organizations to have a broader reach. When I say this, I want to emphasize how important it is to have an open dialogue with these women's organizations and not repeat previous errors in peace building by completely ignoring local communities and their existing work in peace building. After meeting these incredible women and hearing about their experiences, I now am completely clear that I want to go into peace-building work and conflict resolution and learn from women around the world about how they achieve peace in their communities and societies. I want to thank Amina Omar, Sia Rodi, the women at Zenobia Women's Assembly, and the internal security forces for their willingness to work with me and for their unwavering bravery on behalf of women everywhere. As the women in the Zenobia Women's Assembly said, every woman has a revolution inside of her. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barrett. And I don't know if you want to look at the chat, but a number of people have responded to the question that you posed at the beginning of your talk, and nobody has seen any articles or posts discussing Kurdish or non-Kurdish women in the north or eastern part of Syria. So yeah, I don't think you're probably too surprised to hear that outcome.
Oh, yeah. And it was good to keep in mind that answer while I was talking about these women, because it's really important that they get more recognition on a global scale.
Yes, absolutely. We're now going to move on to our second speaker today, Daniela Herrera. Daniela is a fourth-year student at George Washington University, and she will graduate with a degree in international affairs, concentrating on gender in international affairs and contemporary cultures and societies, as well as with an art history minor. She has conducted research on migration and gender-related issues in Latin America, West Asia, and North Africa. Daniela is also the Director of Outreach for the Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. So Daniela, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Daniela. Thank you all for being here today. As mentioned, I am lucky enough to be a student here at the Elliott School of International Affairs. And being able to study here has exposed me to quite a few amazing opportunities. One of these opportunities was being able to attend the first ever LGBTQIA+ Issues in International Affairs class taught by Professor Neela Ghoshal. And funny enough, the day that I decided to join Professor Goshal's class was the day that I decided to join the Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. I had attended the consortium's yearly International Women's Day celebration during my sophomore year, in which they were highlighting the anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And they had invited 4 amazing leaders in advancing and diversifying feminist foreign policy. One of them was my professor at the time, the lovely Dr. Shirley, who you've already met. And then my soon-to-be professor, Neela Ghoshal, who spoke about the ways in which LGBTQ+ voices could and must be included in these policies and in the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Me, coming from a Mexican family with a Navy and a Catholic background, talks about gender and sexual diversity are a bit complicated. And to be honest, being the only one dedicating her future career to it can be a bit exhausting to do so. So being able to hear people that I had considered mentors talk about the importance of what I was studying, what I was doing my research in and everything was really, really huge motivation for me. But more than anything, it made me think back to all my classes that I'd been taking and made me want to ask some questions. I mean, how many foreign policies had I read and analyzed for my classes? And out of all of them, how many included something on the protection of sexual and gender minorities? The first one that came to mind to me was my own country's, Mexico's. But obviously, having lived there and experienced everything there in the society and everything, I know that writing something on paper isn't the same as implementing it, which made me ask even more questions. Was the inclusion genuine, or was it just a check in the box for them? And how do we make sure that the inclusion of LGBTQ+ voices in spaces is genuinely heard and included? So I think it's pretty obvious that I could not miss Professor Goshal's class at all. As Victor Madrigal Borolos, the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, stated in a 2022 report, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans and gender diverse people become highly targeted in conflict settings, not only because of social prejudice that does exist already, but because of the weaponization of this stigma that already exists around LGBTQ+ community. Also, gender and sexual violence are one of the main obstacles to peace and stability, as many women, LGBT+ members of communities, and activists, human rights defenders are targeted on the basis of both their gender and sexual identity, but also because of their roles as social leaders. This is the case in Colombia, where parties of armed conflict saw violence against LGBTQ+ and gender diverse persons as a military opportunity to gain legitimacy on the basis of the shared prejudice that already exists against the community. LGBTQ+ members of the community in Colombia, along with human rights activists, are still highly targeted in the country, with more than 1,200 human rights defenders and social leaders having been killed in Colombia since 2016, and 148 reported killings of LGBTQ+ people in 2022. This is all despite Colombia having a peace agreement that includes over 100 measures based on gender approaches, of which 39 of are inclusive of LGBTQ plus individuals. And it wasn't easy to get this agreement to be passed, as there was a lot of pushback from religious and conservative groups in Colombia who were against the inclusion of gender in the peace accords, and specifically of the LGBTQ plus society. It was up to LGBTQ plus civil society groups to gather an incredible amount of evidence and a lot of changes in the language to be discussing gender and sexuality to prove that they, as a community, should be included in these peace accords. Today, inclusive gender approaches do exist in the final Colombian peace agreement, and that is progress and it should be celebrated. But again, how do we make sure that the inclusion of LGBTQ plus experiences is genuine and heard in this agreement? As mentioned, discrimination and violence against LGBTQ plus people in Colombia is still incredibly high, with Colombia still being one of the most dangerous countries in Latin America for LGBTQ plus communities. And the language in the agreement, as I mentioned already, had to be filtered down a lot, so it isn't as direct as it should be. Thankfully, Marcela Sanchez reminded members of the UN Security Council, and more specifically of the Colombian government, during a briefing last April, how we could do this. This is the woman that I want to tell you about, Marcela Sanchez. The government of Malta, which held the presidency of the Security Council for April this year, invited Marcela Sanchez to provide a civil society perspective and recommendations regarding peace efforts in Colombia. Sanchez is a lesbian Colombian activist with expertise in peace building, women's political participation, and human rights in Colombia. She's also the co-founder and executive director of Colombia Diversa, which is an organization that has defended the rights of LGBTQIA plus population in Colombia and was very involved in the making of the final peace agreements and has done so since 2004. In her briefing, which was sponsored by the Women, Peace and Security NGO Working Group, she urged the Colombian government and the UN Security Council to protect and include LGBTQ people and their voices in every stage of peace efforts, and this included negotiations, ceasefire, demobilization efforts, transitional justice processes, and the design of reparation measures. While specific percentages of LGBTQ plus people involved in the final negotiations for the peace accords aren't readily available, there was an inclusion of 41 gender-specific provisions, and largely due to the participation and efforts of civil society groups in Colombia, which were able to, again, through their work, open 2 cases in the special jurisdiction for peace on the persecution of LGBTQ plus people during the armed conflict. This made the Special Jurisdiction for Peace the first transitional justice tribunal in the world to recognize that in the scope of armed conflict, LGBTQ plus people were targeted because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Also, the peace agreements were drafted by looking at many feminist frameworks found in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and this includes Resolution 1325, which I had mentioned earlier, and its follow-up resolutions in the centered participation and protection. However, what made it so impactful in Colombia was that they took a more holistic approach to gender, which was why they were able to include more LGBTQ plus voices in the final draft. However, Ms. Sanchez reminded her audience that most of these efforts were being done by civil society, especially LGBTQ plus civil society, and that these efforts counted because they were telling a message to the Colombian LGBTQ plus community that their lives mattered. However, she also sent a message about what happens when it isn't implemented. Those efforts aren't celebrated and they aren't respected. In Colombia's last report on human rights defenders, there were reports of societal abuse and sexual assault of LGBTQI plus persons and activists. In fact, the NGO Caribe Afirmativo reported that on May 1st, Dani Sharif Polo, or La Pola as she was known, a representative of LGBTQ plus victims in the Colombian Caribbean, was assaulted and later died. There were allegations even of police violence based on sexual orientation. So, while the inclusion of LGBT plus voices in Colombian peace agreements is something to be celebrated, as I mentioned, Sanchez pointed out that it was mainly thanks to the community. But to the Colombian government, every single case that went unresolved, every single life that was lost and wasn't reported, to them, what the message that they were sending was that LGBTQ plus people in Colombia were dispensable and that their lives were dispensable. And Marcela Sanchez brought that to them. Before I go with Ms. Sanchez's story, I would like to ask you all a question that Professor Goshal asked us during our very first class. How many UN Security Council resolutions address violence related to sexual orientation and gender identity? I'll give you all a couple of minutes to rake through the mind file, if you will. Well, the answer is 0. And the reason why I'm asking this question is because I want you all to understand just how important it was that Ms. Sanchez gave the recommendations to the UN Security Council. On April 9th of this year, very, very recently, not only did Ms. Sanchez advocate for the inclusion of Colombian LGBTQ plus voices, but she advocated for LGBTQ plus voices globally as she gave the first full briefing regarding security issues that impact LGBTQ plus voices in a conflict setting to the UN Security Council. This means that since 1946, when it was established, that's 78 years, the Security Council had not received a briefing that defended and highlighted LGBTQ plus voices in peace building. And that's what happens when the Women, Peace, and Security takes on a more holistic understanding of gender. You open up spaces for important conversations that are being pushed to the margins. And more than anything, you bring not only visibility, but also accountability to a larger audience. There needs to be more data on the LGBTQ plus populations in general, but particularly during situations of armed conflict. Feminist policies like the Women, Peace, and Security agenda must continue to include gender and sexual diversity in their framework. Multilateral institutions, such as the UN Security, that are responsible for promoting peace building must highlight LGBTQ plus experiences in their approaches to peace. Most importantly, they need to allow meaningful participation of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse people in peace negotiations and implement effective measures to protect LGBTQ plus activists. LGBTQ and gender diverse persons must have so much to contribute to peace building and peacekeeping, and it should not be reduced to passive victims of violence that they are. They are not. Like the LGBTQ plus people, civil society groups that participated in drafting the final peace accords in Colombia, and like Sanchez, that reminded the UN Security Council and the Colombian government of the role that they play in protecting LGBTQ plus communities. There is evidence that major progress is made when gender and sexual minorities are allowed a space at the table. Numbers of violent incidents do go down and more data is gathered. Families and friends feel more confident to stand up for their LGBTQ plus loved ones. However, real and effective change can only really be accomplished when the inclusion is genuine. If security and peace building efforts leave out marginalized groups, there isn't any durable peace. I mean, if we do not include all members of society in our peace efforts, then they're not complete peace efforts. Accountability starts within ourselves. And I urge you all to make sure that the inclusion of LGBTQ plus people and voices in your everyday life is genuine. As the title of this conference says, status quo no more, because it really hasn't worked. This is why I'm speaking to you today. We can create systematic change by making sure that marginalized groups are being heard. We can all make all the difference by being the friend or the family member that listens. Before I leave you all, I would like to really quickly give a shout out to my mom and my dad who have themselves made such a long progress in being able to discuss gender and sexual diversity. Like I said, it does make all the difference to have that support. So gracias pa, gracias ma. And again, thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you for drawing our attention to the exclusion of LGBTQAI plus populations in peace processes and your call for their inclusion, and also raising our awareness of the fact that there are no UN Security Council resolutions addressing violence against that particular population. So thank you for your talk today. I'm now going to turn to our next speaker today, and I'm going to introduce you all very briefly to Sanjana Nihalani. And Sanjana is going to talk to us specifically about art and the practice of art in peace processes and building communities through and beyond conflict. So Sanjana Nihalani is a second-year student at the George Washington University studying international affairs and philosophy. She recently served as the Director for Student and Alumni Engagement for the Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. Her passion for learning is about educating others on gender, equality and peace-related issues stemming from her own background as the only female child of immigrant parents. She plans to go to law school, where she will continue her studies pursuing peace building and the promotion of human rights. So Sanjana, I'm now going to hand over to you, and we look forward to hearing more about your story. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As Dr. Graham mentioned, I am a sophomore here at the George Washington University. And before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to ask you all a question, because I understand that a lot of us are in the kind of stressful field of peace building. So I'd like to ask, what creative outlets do you use to relieve your stress? I'll give us all a second to think. Now, the use of art as a coping mechanism or a therapy is not new in the Western world. I'm sure many of us, myself included, have turned to watercolor or music or the odd Zumba class to help us work through personal traumas. I myself grew up dancing, and I continue to do so on my college's competitive dance team. And dance has always been a respite for me. No matter what I was going through in other parts of my life, I always found I could lose myself in dancing, and I found some of my closest friends, and I've made some of my best memories while dancing. Now, my parents encouraged me to try other art forms as well, but in school and at home, it was never really assumed that I would be able to make a viable living or fulfill any purpose as an artist. Now, whether that was solely because of my skill level as a 6-year-old finger painter, it was never emphasized that any of the changes I would like to make in the world could be brought to fruition through art. So I, like so many others, left art for the weekends and started pursuing international affairs with hopes to go to law school. But how does our understanding of the utility of art shift when we think of artistic expression as a means of bringing about social change? How do artistic movements coincide with and influence peace building and revolutionary efforts by women throughout history and throughout the world? Now, if you think you have no idea what I'm talking about, consider every social justice and revolutionary movement that you might have learned about in school. Then consider every name from those eras that has come to fame. Think of Frida Kahlo, whose life and art was massively influenced by the Mexican nationalist movement of the early 1900s, or Aretha Franklin and her powerful voice that rang through radios and the streets during civil rights protests. And even Anna Pavlova, the Russian dancer who in the midst of the Bolshevik Revolution helped spread ballet as an entertainment form for the masses, rather than as an exclusive aristocratic art form. Now, you'll notice that none of these artists are named as revolutionary or political game makers in the large majority of Western history books. But we all also know that these books often reflect a male or masculine view of history that writes out women's involvement in community and peace building. Throughout history, art has received the same treatment as women. It has largely been overlooked as a tool for peace building. Therefore, my goal in the next few minutes is to take you with me as I explore how art can serve as a vehicle for revolutionary expression for women artists and as a peace-building tool for communities in conflict. A common gender norm that those of us studying women, peace, and security often discuss is the expectation in a lot of cultures that women should stay at home and stay out of politics. This historical paucity of women's formal involvement in global political processes is especially concerning because women are impacted by social change often to a greater degree than men. Whereas men can often separate the political and domestic sphere, for women, the two are intertwined due to women's historical relegation and restriction to the domestic sphere. Widespread incidents of gender-based discrimination, including sexual violence, loss of family, livelihoods, and personal autonomy, are consistently correlated with periods of conflict. However, during these periods and afterwards, gender-based violence is too often under-investigated and therefore under-reported on by news and informational sources. Even in peace-building efforts, women remain marginalized and unacknowledged due to gender bias and the inherent assumption that women are politically incompetent. And this is despite evidence from numerous organizations that peace agreements, like Dr. Graham mentioned, are more effective and likely to be longer lasting when women are involved in formal negotiations. Women and sexual minorities have always been important actors in society, as we are the domestic workers, the underground laborers, and the mothers whose every move, action, and words influence the thoughts of the next generation. Every part of a woman's life is scrutinized and restricted, and even our bodies are seen as inherently political. Therefore, the WPS agenda, or the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, has been implemented through national action plans worldwide to open political spaces to women and the gendered perspective. And I believe that the progress that has resulted from the aforementioned UN Security Council Resolution 1325 will have a lasting impact on the world and future generations. However, I think it's important to understand resistance and peacemaking as a feminist inheritance, rather than as a realm that has only recently opened up to us in order to reshape our understanding of women's involvement in history. Our acknowledgement of women and sexual minorities within peace-building and revolutionary processes still has room to improve. And harnessing historical and cultural knowledge on women's unorthodox political mechanisms to guide future methods of peace-building may just be the way forward. Therefore, I ask, if women have always borne the brunt of political and colonial change, how have we utilized alternative pathways, particularly artistic ones, to make our voices heard? Well, more and more literature is coming to the surface on women's involvement in peace and protest movements. The historical Women in Black movement is a wide-reaching example of a global women's anti-war movement, as it began in response to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Groups of Israeli women gathered at a silent vigil in Jerusalem in 1988, dressed in black after the First Intifada, to protest Israeli occupation, but more specifically to bring awareness to the crimes being committed by Israeli soldiers against Palestinian women and girls. Since 1988, the Women in Black movement has spread to Colombia, Germany, India, South Africa, Argentina, and more than a dozen other countries, and it continues to this day. However, direct protest movements are really only a small portion of women's political influence, because women involved in overt protests tend to be targeted, harassed, and threatened, either by disdainful onlookers or even by their larger governments. Therefore, because of these repercussions, many women throughout history have found different ways to protest and bring awareness to the plight of their communities. As was previously mentioned, women's bodies are so often the site of marginalization, as so many colonial empires have used the female body as yet another tool with which to take away a nation and its population's autonomy. Because of this, the female experience of colonialism and oppressive systems is held in women's bodies, which brings a physicality to the trauma experienced by women that is rarely discussed in political circles or in mainstream media, whether that's due to cultural taboos or under investigation. It should also be mentioned that sexual and gender-based violence is not just a trauma experienced by developing and colonial populations, as has been demonstrated by numerous movements, including the Me Too movement in American media. This physical trauma has therefore been the focus of many female artist activists, as art allows women the opportunity to create a fixed representation of their trauma without overtly involving themselves in a political discussion that could endanger their lives. For example, the ruthless apartheid in South Africa, which facilitated exploitation and racism, also placed Black women at the bottom of a social hierarchy. Apartheid marginalized and degraded the Black female body. In response, Black female South African performance artists Bernie Searle and Tracy Rose displayed confrontational images of their naked bodies, often smeared in traditional spices or even trapped in a glass display case. These images were not presented for the male gaze, but rather they attempted to reclaim the artists' identities and negate the distillation of Black female bodies as purely a site of conflict and marginalization. Both Tracy Rose and Bernie Searle stated their intentions to disrupt and deconstruct the identity forced upon them, and their performant art pieces remain a testament to the multitudes of controversies and contradictions that the South African Black female body represents to a colonial oppressor. Now, although in a modern Western context, artistic traits and the notion of being artsy are commonly associated with femininity, I think we can see that both traditional and contemporary art forms have given voice to gender diverse identities that have been silenced. This also rings true among Palestinian women, a population that has been subjected to occupation for decades. Cultural erosion in Palestine has accompanied the violent conflict dominating the region. Palestinians have a long history of resistance and internal attempts at peace building alongside other women in organizations such as Women Waging Peace. One form in which Palestinian women have exercised both artistic power and preservational instincts is in the ancestral art form of tatreez, a form of embroidery in which colorful threads are joined together to create distinct images. Tatreez is a form of education for younger girls, a vehicle for political and artistic expression, and it represents generations of Palestinian women who have worked to sustain and promote their history. As Palestinian NPR producer Elina Mohammed explains, every single stitch holds the memories and experiences of the embroiderer, and through it, generations of women have passed down personal stories and documented major events, ranging from the tumultuous relationship of the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law to the Intifada, when Palestinian flags were banned in public. So Palestinian women started embroidering them on their thobes. For generations of Palestinian women, tatreez has been a platform for storytelling, protest, and preservation. Now, my final story that I would like to impart you with is that of the tawaifs, or courtesans in South Asia, specifically and in India and Pakistan. During British colonial rule, Tawaiifs were frequently misunderstood and derogatorily labeled as prostitutes or nautch girls by British officials. However, in reality, these women were highly skilled performers and were considered to be the custodians of high culture, etiquette, and artistic traditions within their local communities. The Tawaiifs also held a unique place in society and defied gender norms as they were allowed to operate with relative autonomy. They could own property, control their own wealth, and they enjoyed high-level education in dance, music, literature, and politics. The British Raj's attempt to marginalize and demean Tawaiifs was part of a broader colonial effort to dismantle indigenous cultural institutions. Despite this, Tawaiifs' salons became hubs for anti-colonial sentiment. Now, although Tawaiifs' music and dance forms such as thumri and kathak continue to be practiced today, their vital contributions to the resistance against colonial rule have largely faded from both Western and South Asian public memory. As a young woman who grew up finding peace in art, and as a young professional with hopes to continue going on in peace building, learning about these women was incredibly inspiring to me. So why do these stories matter? These stories matter because they reflect female traditions of peace building and political discourse that today's Western peace building efforts tend to ignore. I think we all know a lack of cultural and historical understanding works against the implementation of the WPS agenda in non-Western countries. The examples I've mentioned are not the only examples of women using artistic tradition to be engaged in political discourse, and incorporating cultural understanding and historical analysis may increase efficacy and harm reduction in peace-building work. And it will guide the Western world to stop projecting victimhood onto women in conflict, to open the door to truly inclusive discourse and real progress for the women, peace, and security agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjana, and thank you to our audience as well for participating in the question that Sanjana asked you at the beginning. Sanjana, you might want to take a look at some of the responses there, similar to your own. And now I'm just very aware of a shortness of time, so I'm going to move directly to our final speaker today. I'm going to introduce you now to Elina Salian, who is a rising third-year senior at George Washington University, majoring in economics with minors in international affairs and political science. She is also the director of publications for the Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security, and is a licensee of TEDx Foggy Bottom. Myself and Elina worked together very closely on my TED Talk last year, and it was a wonderful experience. She is currently interning for the US Department of State in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. Elina is going to take us on a journey now to India, where she's going to talk about women's rights groups and their particular activism. Over to you, Elina.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. Thank you so much for having me today. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the content of this talk will include disturbing instances of sexual violence and of sexual assault. Last month, we saw yet another example of how India fails to protect its women. To understand the context of why I am giving this talk today, I want to go back to the fall of 2022. I arrived at George Washington University, like my peers, with a strong desire to gain an academic foundation to support my passion for gender equality and feminist movements. I found the consortium and immediately knew that this community of students shared my passion and wanted to bring the core tenets of gendered peacebuilding to fruition in our careers. See, feminist figures raised me. I never thought that my value lay in a future marriage, or that a job was too ambitious, or that raising kids was my prerogative. As the daughter of immigrants, I know that my childhood was not the norm for most girls. And as my uncle says, I was born with a silver tooth. While I was born with massive privilege, I was also lucky enough to be surrounded by transparency and access to media and stories. So when my peers and I received a message from the Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security about a peace-building conference that would take place this year, I felt compelled to provide a platform for the women and girls in India who did not have the same upbringing that I was privileged to. As she mentioned, Dr. Graham advises our student-led organization, and we discussed the possibility of applying a gender lens to stories that we felt connected to. For me, the connection was to the countless women in India who have been the victims of sexual violence. This country was and is the home for many of my family members, my grandmothers, great-grandmothers, aunts, cousins. Months into the process of researching, I opened the headlines of the news and saw that yet another brutal attack was perpetrated on a young female doctor in Kolkata, India. A 31-year-old doctor's body was found in a lecture hall at the city's public medical college and hospital, with signs of sexual assault and torture, where the woman had gone to rest during her night shift. We do not know her name. The Supreme Court directed the Union government to remove all references to her name, photos, and video clips of the doctor from all social media and electronic media platforms. A bench later affirmed that revealing the identity of a sexual assault victim is a violation of her dignity. In my mind, this begged the question, how is this saving her dignity? It seems like a way to hide the patriarchal imposed shame associated with being the victim of sexual violence, almost as if it was the victim's fault. In this case, a student doctor training and studying to protect her own community. This directive is a reminder that even if the legal system claims to offer protection after the fact, it is not done enough to prevent these violent acts from happening. You may ask, why is India, a state whose leaders often brag is the largest democracy in the world, the site of constant violations of women's human rights? Indian culture fosters and upholds the stigma around sexual assault. This stigma leads to ignorance in communities and villages as to what sexual violence means, and it also means that underreporting of sexual assault and sexual violence cases across India is rampant. Victims may believe that by seeking justice and reporting their cases, they, along with their family, will face humiliation. But these circumstances are exacerbated even more by India's caste system. Though constitutionally abolished in 1950, the societal implications of caste hierarchy continue to manifest into everyday life. I am now going to speak about a very distressing incident. In 2020, a 19-year-old girl in the city of Hathras in the state of Uttar Pradesh died after a brutal assault perpetrated by her 4 neighbors. Despite the victim's testimony naming the 4 men as the assailants, the police denied the assault and delayed the investigation. They falsified reports and destroyed forensic evidence. The victim was a Dalit, a member of the lowest caste, and the perpetrators were Brahmins, the highest caste. Caste-based discrimination is clearly persistent in Indian society. Attackers prey on lower caste victims because the justice system in India does not truly protect them. When women are attacked, the question is not, why did that man commit a violent act? Instead, women are asked why they were out of the house late at night. What were they wearing? What exactly did they do to invite the assault? Women and girls are made responsible for the male gaze. This has created a culture of impunity for perpetrators that needs to be broken through grassroots peace-building efforts that emphasize justice, not just the cessation of conflict through top-down laws and amendments. In this long history of violence, have women tried to break the cycle of failed justice? When people feel that the regime is not taking care of them with the necessary resources, they create an uprising, and India is not unique to this trend. In response to the systemic failures of the Indian justice system, some women have resorted to vigilantism. One group in the state of Uttar Pradesh has reportedly accumulated 20,000 members. The group initially attempts to resolve issues through dialogue with the perpetrator, usually a husband, but if the abuser fails to change, they resort to physical retaliation, which means confronting and assaulting the perpetrator. I want to make clear that I am not advocating for the use of violence to combat violence. While the actions of the gang were born out of frustration with the system's failure to protect women, such methods do not offer a sustainable solution to systemic violence. I also recognize the irony of discussing a violent vigilante group at a peace-building conference, but the gang's existence goes to show the desperate routes that victims will take when they do not see justice in their own systems. This approach does fall short of empowering women to leave abusive situations altogether. And this limitation also highlights the need for systemic change. Women are often unable to escape violence because of financial dependence, lack of education, social and family stigma, or the dowry system, which keeps people tied to their abusers. The existence of the group does underscore the need for social reforms that provide women with the resources and support necessary to break free from violence and cycles of abuse embedded in Indian culture. Our student consortium revolves around the tenets of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. As students, we recognize how these pillars of peace can enact change. And I want to apply these values that we have built a community around here at GW to understand how to prevent the violence in India. A subnational response lay in creating and supporting women-led investigations and support communities. The Special Investigation Team brings a gendered perspective to the investigation and justice process of sexual violence, ensuring that cases are handled with more sensitivity and professionalism rather than victim blaming and systemic issues within the police in India. Victims often distrust the justice system due to a history and culture of inaction and prejudice, and they are more likely to engage with women investigators, which will create a more equitable justice process. Their presence is not just symbolic, it's practical. Women belong in the peace-building process if we want change. India has supported the WPS agenda internationally by contributing female peacekeepers to UN peacekeeping missions. In 2007, the UN mission in Liberia deployed a female foreign police unit, which was composed of experienced Indian police officers. But India's UN peacekeeping actions may have not fully envisioned the WPS agenda because rather than considering the long-term impact of an all-female police unit on conflict management in Liberia, Indian representatives instead emphasized the role in teaching women self-defense and inspiring them to participate in the front line of police forces. India, therefore, is coupling prevention and protection with participation in the police force. And India needs to focus more resources on the prevention pillar of the WPS agenda. Women's inclusion in the investigative and justice process promotes peace building within these communities and law enforcement. Now, I want to ask a question to you all. How often do you see stories in US media about sexual violence in other countries like India? The truth is, even as avid readers of media and news, trying to constantly stay engaged with circumstances across the world, there are far too many women whose names we will never know. I open the news every day, and to speak bluntly, there's a new case of sexual violence against women or girls in India every single day. The number of confirmed assault cases in India has risen from 337,922 in 2014 to 445,256 in 2022, which is the latest data made public. And so these numbers likely only touch the surface of a much larger issue. The 2016 Arilar case, the 2017 Unnao case, the 2019 Hyderabad case, 2020 Hathras case, 2024 Kolkata case. These are a few of the stories that have caught media attention, and the monikers of these instances refer to the cities or states in India where the assault occurred, not the name of the actual victim. The silencing has continued after the fact in Kolkata, back to the young doctor, where police fired tear gas and water cannons to disperse thousands of protesters demanding justice. The government's directive to remove her name and image from media outlets only reinforces the culture of silence that protects perpetrators more than victims. While the intention may supposedly be to preserve the victim's dignity, it buries the truth, allowing the following story to unfold in much the same way as the last. People continue to protest and fight the system, but those in power have not reformed it enough, which leaves space for the following incident. Change begins at the grassroots level with women-led peace-building efforts. We need public accountability, community education and support, media transparency. Passive outrage was insufficient to protect the 31-year-old doctor laying for arrest during her night shift. India needs reform that protects future generations of women and makes space for the silenced voices whose names we do not know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elina. And thank you, everybody, for your participation in our talks today and listening to our student speakers from the Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. Just want to remind you all that I am Dr. Shirley Graham. I'm the Director of the Gender Equality Initiative at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University, and the founder of the Student Consortium. I would like to encourage any of you now who are still here and who still have time to engage in a conversation with our speakers. If you have any questions you would like to ask, you can unmute and turn on your video, and we'll be around for the next 10 or 15 minutes. Thank you. I'm just going to have a look at questions. So Stephen Aiello says, can you share any links to the project? Which project, Stephen? Are you talking about the one in India that Elina was just talking about? I'm presuming that's what you're talking about. Do you have any links, Elina, that you can share?
I do. I have a couple of
articles.
articles.
Oh, to the consortium. Yes, sorry. Okay, yeah. Well, Elina can also share links, but I can also share a link to the consortium. The website is wpsconsortium.org. Let me just put it in. Thank you, Silly. Silly, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but I really like your idea where you say it would be great to turn the presentations into a publication with overall observations. That's a really, really excellent idea. Okay, and so Danny, there's a question there that you might want to respond to specifically about minorities in peace building processes. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, well, thank you, Stephen, for asking the question. Yeah, so something that I have found a lot, I focus a lot of my research throughout my academic career and everything on including minorities, specifically gender minorities and sexual orientation minorities. And what I found very helpful has been mainly funding a lot of the civil society orgs, like local ones, because they are usually the ones who are able to, talk directly to people who might not want to go to the police if something happens, or to maybe they're not comfortable with like their family knowing and stuff like that. So I would say the best way to do it is to focus on local civil society organizations. One example, also in Colombia, well, this one was actually a lot of Latin American countries, Colombia, Argentina, a bunch of different places. And what they did was they created a space online for people to reach out to them, where it was, again, like encouraging not only community between each other online, which is, kind of safe in some cases, where it might not be safe to, meet with people in person and everything. And that really does help with data and everything, which is important to include minorities. So that would be my biggest recommendation, is start local, because local change does actually, in local communities, do look out for each other most of the time, and they will be the ones to bring it up. So yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit or answers something.
Thank you, Danny. I know Barrett also wants to come in on this question.
Yeah, again, echoing Danny's sentiments. Thank you, Stephen, for asking this question. It's a really important question to be asking during this time. In my experience, when I was talking to the women in organizations in North and East Syria, and just general knowledge about peace building and creating a gendered lens for peace building, one, as Danny said, funding is incredibly important. It's also important to have data on what's happening, which kind of coincides with funding, because the more that we can understand what's actually going on in these areas, the more that we can understand how actually to help them and what specific initiatives would be necessary in order to create change. And I also think that just in the case of North and East Syria, they're doing an amazing job, because not only for Zenobia Women's Assembly, but for other organizations such as Malajin, they're creating committees that focus on specific needs. They're not creating a one-size-fits-all solution where they just create a general peace-building initiative that goes to all women. They're asking women in different communities, how can I help you? What are you searching for? What are you looking for? And then the committees specifically under Zenobia Women's Assembly help focus on economic rights, reconciliation, also for women's participation in politics. There's a specific committee, and also for education. So they're making sure with the resources that they have that they're able to acknowledge every facet of women's inequalities. But again, as Danny has said, and also what the women who I talked to have said, there aren't enough resources to go around and to ensure yet that every woman in every neighborhood, in every area in Northeast Syria and just in general are able to get the needs that they are able to have the needs met. So I think that that's an important step to acknowledge. But again, I do want to emphasize, as Danny already emphasized, acknowledging the local communities and what they've already done and collaborating them is really important, because if international organizations go in assuming that they know best, they often don't. And then it can be actually more harmful for women who've been impacted by conflict and violence in that case.
Thank you, Barrett. And I know Elina has some comments to make specifically about the caste system in India as well.
Yes, definitely. In like I kind of mentioned in my talk, the one case in Hathras, that's a rural community. It tends to be that in these rural spaces where there's a lack of education, that's where the caste-based discrimination and prejudice really prevails. And so the Dalits, the lowest caste in India, they really don't have a means through the law for social justice, specifically in cases of sexual violence. And there are different civil society groups, just like Danny and Barrett mentioned, that are trying to help promote Dalit cases and make sure that they have access to resources and social justice. But the same thing, without the education and without the proper funding of those education initiatives, the stigma continues, the cycle perpetuates. And so really just the caste system in India, like I mentioned, it's technically unconstitutional, but to some aspect with the grassroots peace building and education efforts, it has to be met with the law. And for instance, right now in India, sexual assault only means it's not well defined. There's only one case of instance of what sexual assault is defined as. It's not go far enough and include all these cases and all these things that are happening to the women. So just bridging that massive gap of the law not protecting all women, specifically of lower castes, and also a lack of education and resources for women in communities in rural areas.
Thank you so much, Elina. I'm now going to finish. I think Sanjana wants to come in with a final comment, and then we're going to wrap up this event. So thank you again, everybody, for staying a little bit longer on the call.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add, obviously, when we speak about minorities, there's a lot of different groups of minorities that we're talking about, but specifically in reference to developing communities, I think it's important that Western peace-building efforts also look at like historical and cultural traditions, and they don't project some sort of value system or ideas onto a developing community. I think that's very important when you're thinking about minorities in peace building, is looking at tradition and methods that have already been used rather than going in and trying to disrupt a system, just because that can often create kind of like a cycle of dependence for developing communities on the developing world. And I think that's very important, that you maintain the cultural integrity of a community. Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to add, that I think intention and cultural incorporation are very important when it comes to peace building and inclusion of minorities.
Thank you, Sanjana. So thank you, everybody, today. I think we had a really fascinating discussion, and I hope some of the feedback that you yourselves supplied as audience members may have surprised you around some of the questions that we asked. And thank you again for your participation, and to all of our speakers here today from George Washington University. Okay, we're going to say goodbye now. Thank you all so much.